So we're in United States History book. We're in Chapter 15, Section 3, Bleeding Kansas. We're going to be talking about the Kansas-Nebraska Act and a disaster in Kansas, John Brown, and the Republican Party. And as you can see some of the issues here, we have John Brown, dividing Kansas. There's a picture of that kind of a caricature there. And then we have another one here where in Congress, and we'll find out one of the Southern congressmen almost beat to death one of the Northern congressmen over the issue of slavery. And we have Kansas and Missouri border becoming a terrible area of war and controversy, even to the point of calling it Bleeding Kansas. We have the Nebraska-Kansas Act being here, where Kansas would become a territory separated from the Nebraska territory. The problem was not so much in Nebraska at all, but in Kansas. The issue of slavery. Start with the Kansas-Nebraska Act. In January 1854, Senator Stephen A. Douglas from Illinois, here's a picture of him, and he would end up debating with Abraham Lincoln. And so he was a very colorful politician. And when he talked, he was a great spokesman, a great orator, and he had all these gestures when he talked. But he organized the vast land west and north of Missouri and Iowa, and he called this land there, as we see in this picture, the Nebraska Territory. And he knew that this territory would be attracting many settlers, so he basically was putting forth a bill called the Kansas-Nebraska Act bill to divide these two territories. And basically, the Kansas debate would happen then on popular sovereignty. He said, remember, Douglas too, he would also go with popular sovereignty, saying actually the states and the territories, the people need to decide what they want to do, whether they want to be slave states or free states. And so, barring the Missouri Compromise, which already remember Missouri Compromise is when they said the degrees of 36 to 30 degrees latitude, that line right here is 36-30 line, you see right here. So basically saying above this line would be what? Would be free, and below would be the slave states, that line. Well, you can see Kansas fell pretty much in the north, so, but there would be issue now with this popular sovereignties that some of these northern territories, could they indeed be slave states? Well, in Nebraska, the area of Nebraska, going into Montana, Nebraska, Wyoming, some South Dakota up here, this whole area that would become these states, but had no problem. They were going to be free states, and they had no problem with this issue. But the issue would happen in the Kansas territory, mainly because Missouri here was a slave state, right? So here we have the picture. These are free states. These are the slave states. These are the territories now. California, indeed, had already decided to be a free state. Debates would happen on Kansas now. Here we have, it's kind of crazy. We have Kansas here, and we have no slavery, yes slaves, no slavery. It was so divided all the way through Kansas. So the Kansas-Nebraska bill brought again strong debates on what? Slavery. Remember, we had the old politicians that were so famous and famous orators that had given their speeches for the Compromise of 1850. We had Clay, Calhoun, and Webster. By this time, they all three had died. So now we have these younger politicians coming up, especially Stephen Douglas. And he had presented this bill, and it was adopted because of Stephen Douglas's strong influence. He was a great speaker, he was a great orator, and he was a great influence in Congress. And so new territories said will be perfectly free to form and regulate their domestic future, only subject to the Constitution. So he said, in these free territories, they can form whatever they want on their domestic future, including what? Slavery. So there was a sectional split in the political parties then. The Whigs were actually split. There were some of the Whigs that were very much Southerners, and there's some of the Whigs that were very much Northerners, and they split totally on the issue of slavery, and to the point where the Whigs, the party, was even no more. They couldn't even stand because they were so divided. So the Whigs, we don't hear a Whig party anymore, do we? And the Democrats also were split on the issue of slavery. Some of the Northern Democrats basically were saying we do not support slavery, and in the South they did. So the Democrats had split the Democrat Party too. So the Whigs were split, the Democrats were split, and the North and the South were now drawn farther apart, especially on the issue of slavery coming into the territory. Here we have the issue being actually fought about. This is bleeding Kansas. In Kansas, they started fighting. We're going to find out. The Kansas-Nebraska out nullified the line of the Missouri Compromise, saying that northern states, see, Kansas was in the north, saying that northern states could be slave states. This was a big issue now, and it reopened the debate of slavery in the United States to the point of what? They even, the congressmen were fighting when they were in Congress, getting together. Well, we called this bleeding Kansas. So Kansas became the area. Why? Because the disasters that would happen. And like I said, there were no problems in Nebraska, but now Kansas would be the area where the issue of slavery would be fought, on both sides, for and against. So both Free Soilers, which were against slavery, and the Southerners, which were pro-slavery, were determined to control Kansas. They thought, okay, now we need to get a lot of Southerners into Kansas. We need to get a lot of slave owners into Kansas. And the abolitionists, we need to get a lot of abolitionists into Kansas. So they're sending people in to stand and vote, because remember, it's popular vote, it's popular sovereignty. So they wanted to get enough votes so that Kansas would either be all slave or all free. So anti-slavery settlers flocked into Kansas, and they made their headquarters in Lawrence. Here's Lawrence, Kansas. So the whole city of Lawrence, Kansas was abolitionist. They were basically against slavery in Lawrence, Kansas. So the pro-slavery settlers, and they mostly came in from Missouri, because Missouri's the slave state, came over the border, and they too set up a village right there, the city. They found it Lecompton, the name of and they were mostly from Missouri, and they were pro-slavery. So here we have anti-slavery, pro-slavery right next to each other. So you're going to have some problems, right? There was a tense situation in electing officers for government. Now they had to set forth the Kansas government. So what were they going to do? Set forth this Kansas government? Well, of course, they wanted to put in a governor and electing officers that were either totally anti-slavery for Lawrence, basically saying we want slavery, we want to be a free state, and then of course Lecompton, the pro-slavery, no, we want to be a slave state. So it was very tense. And droves of Missourians, what happened then, they were voting. This is called voter fraud, but bunches of Missourians, which was a slave state here, right? Here's Missouri next to Kansas. They flooded into Kansas. All these people came. See the picture there of these wagons? They all came running into Kansas. They came running into Kansas to vote, right? They were Missourians. They weren't even from Kansas, but they were going to vote for Kansas, right? So they came in, founding Lecompton. We know that, but they also they swept across the border to vote illegally. They're not legally going to vote because they're really not. They don't live in Kansas. They live in Missouri. But they thought, who would know? So all these Missourians, which were pro-slavery, came into Kansas. And the pro-slavery officials illegally elected to pass laws to squelch the abolitionists. They illegally elected these pro-slavery officials so that they can basically get rid of any abolitionist doctrine that would come in and make Kansas a slave state. So the Free Soilers, remember the Free Soilers are against slavery. They negotiated the laws and wrote their own constitution. and they started their legislation in Topeka, Kansas. So we have, you know, all this happening on Lawrence being against slavery, Lecompton being for slavery. Then we have Topeka over here setting forth and writing their own, saying, no, we're not going to listen to these other officials that have been elected. So the whole state of Kansas was totally divided. Crazy place. So Kansas had two governments. First of all, they had the pro-slavery government, and the elections in 1855 established a pro-slavery legislature, and the new laws were passed that made helping slaves escape punishable by death. Means if an abolitionist was going to help a slave escape, they would be put to death. Well, of course, the other government said it was anti-slavery and says, we're not going to recognize anything you say either. And they refused to abide by the laws of this pro-slavery government because they said it was an illegal government, that they voted illegally on it, and they established their own governor and legislature. So Kansas now has two whole governments. One was established by fraud, you know, the pro-slavery that come in for slavery, they did it by fraud, and the other had organized in Topeka without any legal authority either. So now the Congress of the United States actually had to decide in the federal government about Kansas. And they found that the pro-slavery government was illegitimate, basically saying the pro-slavery government was a fraud and that they weren't going to recognize the pro-slavery government. And so then, but President Pierce, remember I told you, he was a doughface or whatever. He basically was for slavery. He gave his support to the pro-slavery illegitimate government. So now we really have a bunch of turmoil. Kansas is so divided. Not only that, they're against the president, and the president went over Congress and saying, okay, yeah, the pro-slavery government, even though Congress thinks it's illegitimate, I don't. And so violence, of course, would prevail. So the pro-slavery supporters ransacked Lawrence, Kansas, and destroyed it. So here's the town. They destroyed the whole town. Remember, the whole town was against slavery, right? So they went in and ransacked the town and burned it. So, and that was just the beginning of violence. And then violence in Congress, as I said, Southern Congressman Preston Brooks here beat the abolitionist Senator Charles Sumner almost to death. Here's the Southerner getting mad about him. He's standing up against slavery, so he came over in the midst of Congress and took his cane and almost beat him to death. So this whole argument of Kansas was really getting fiery, right? On top of this, we have John Brown. John Brown there lived 1800 to 1859, and he was a radical abolitionist. He was like, you know, basically as Garrison was in the past, that he was basically, we need to fight against, you know, we need to fight against slavery. And so he was promoting people to fight and attack. And so he went and attacked the settlement of Potawatomi Creek. And Brown snuck in and killed 5 men. And then terror reigned in Bleeding, Kansas. So it says Potawatomi Massacre. On the night of May 24th to May 25th, 1856, a small band of abolitionists led by John Brown murdered 5 pro-slavery just north here along the Potawatomi Creek. This massacre in Bleeding, Kansas is one of the most famous events leading up to the American Civil War. Brown was captured, tried, and hanged for his unsuccessful raid on Harper's Ferry, we'll find in West Virginia. So, but before Harper's Ferry, we have John Brown attacking the pro-slavery settlement. Remember, the pro-slavery settlement had attacked Lawrence, Kansas, and he was going to get back and attack them. And so terror reigned in Bleeding, Kansas. And in 1856, dozens of lives had been lost. And the federal troops were sent into Kansas to try to keep peace. But this violence continued between the abolitionists and the pro-slavery settlements. Also during this time, a new party was formed called the Republican Party. Remember, back in history, Thomas Jefferson had put together the Democratic Republican Party, but that was a different party. That was not the party that's forming here. The beginnings of our Republican Party happened now, during this time before the Civil War. The Republican Party came about due to dissatisfaction over the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So the anti-slavery men joined together from all political parties and that opposed slavery, the extension of slavery in the territories. So if you opposed the extension of slavery in the territories, you would want to join the Republican Party. So the Republican Party was anti-slavery. That was the foundation of the Republican Party. And this party was a coalition of free soilers, some Democrats that were against slavery, and some Whigs that were against slavery. And they met at Ripon, Wisconsin. So here's the birthplace of the Republican Party, at Ripon, Wisconsin. And they formed an entirely new party to oppose slavery. And they called this party the Republican Party. This is right here. One of the founders of the Republican Party was Horace Greeley, and he was basically a writer of newspaper, right? In June 1854, he said a simple name Republican would more fit and design thoughts who had united to restore the Union to extreme mission or champion. Anyway, basically saying, instead of calling it liberty, we're going to call it Republican, but that's the Republican Party. So let's find out who was one of the first to run for president from the Republican Party. On the election of 1856 now, the Republican Party started to grow as many people were against slavery. Many Democrats were against slavery and many Whigs were. And then we have, of course, the Free Soil Party all coming together. So their candidate would be, of course, John C. Fremont from California. Well, he had actually been part of the Bear Revolt in California. But John Fremont and his wife, Jessie, had many followers. And he was called the Pathfinder of the West as an explorer. And she had written books about all of his explorations and you know, the life on the trails and all these things. And Fremont had become extremely popular. And they were both instrumental in California being a free state, you know. So they were, and, you know, because of their popularity, as a lot of women, you know, supported, you know, John Fremont just because of his wife being so popular. And she would even speak at times, you know, politically, which women didn't do back then, you know. So we have, you know, Fremont, and then we have Old Buck. Old Buck was James Buchanan. So Buchanan was the Democratic candidate. James Buchanan lived 1791 to 1868. But Buchanan won the election, partly because the Republicans were a new party, and also Millard Fillmore came in as he had been the vice president that became president. And so he would pretty much split, you know, that party of Republicans, and it would end up that James Buchanan would become president. James Buchanan was a Southerner, and he was pro-slave, right? Buchanan won the election, but the Republicans, though, had a record number of votes and a lot of new followers, and they kept more people kept joining the party even after the election, with not only supporting Fremont, but among those new that were joining was a little-known lawyer, a lawyer that was a rising politician at this time, and his name was what? None other than Abraham Lincoln of Illinois. So here we have, you know, Fremont, this whole fight for presidency, and the issues back then had to do with slavery, but now we have James Buchanan, who would not, you know, really relate politically the issue of slavery in Congress. So in 1856, Buchanan, which was very much of a dull type president would be president. But now we have the Republican Party formed. And rising sectional differences would happen during this time in 1854, but we was going to 1860. So let's do this on another video. I'm going to try not to make the videos so long, but we'll see how things were getting worse and ramping up between those free states and those states that were promoting slavery. Would start what? Leading into the Civil War, right?